Good morning. Thank you for coming. And for those of you that do not know me, I am Tracy Campbell. I am the Director of Resident Services. Welcome. Thank you for braving the weather and coming out this morning. We have a wonderful presentation planned for you this morning. And once you finish eating, if you want to come up closer to the projector and sit in some of these front seats here to see better, we encourage you to do that. And without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Mr. Chadbourne. He will be doing our presentation this morning.
Mr. Chadbourne, how about that? I got called that in the Navy a lot too, which was kind of nice. But this is projecting while the voice is coming through. I do encourage you to come up. Some of the pictures look better when you can see them up close. I gave this presentation about 7 years ago when Linda and I were living in Florida at a slightly different kind of community, and it was Veterans Day, and the opportunity came up to speak a brief presentation on Operation Eagle Claw, and it occurred to me more recently that it was a good time to dust it off and present it here, and then wouldn't you know, Jimmy Carter passed away, which seemed to make it even more relevant. So I'm grateful for your presence here today. And I've got some notes here I'm going to try to pay attention to. Now, Eagle Claw happened in 1980, and I was serving in the peacetime Navy, as they called it at the time, from 1976 to 1983. It had some interesting assignments. The reason why I emphasize peacetime Navy is for the longest time that meant I wasn't eligible for benefits at the Veterans Administration and things like that. But some of you served during the more active times, and salute you for that. Two things you should know about Navy men. First, they're always very proud of their ship, so that's why I was showing you the picture through breakfast of the Mississippi, which was my first ship. And the second thing is Navy guys like to tell sea stories, so I expect to tell a few of those, and Rick already told me that's why you came, right? So, okay, good deal. So my concern or my interest today is to present this Operation Eagle Claw, which happened, and I had a little bit of a very small role, but enough that I have some pictures and things. And with Jimmy Carter's passing, it just seemed like a good opportunity to tell the story. So the 1970s were turbulent years for the country. As you all know, you've lived through that. There was Vietnam, civil rights protests, things like Roe v. Wade decisions and Watergate. Actually, the only one that occurred to me, 1979, at the end of the decade, was the 3 Mile Island incident. That have a narrow interaction with that. And for me, sort of a turbulent decade. I'm a middle-class baby boomer. I narrowly missed getting drafted for Vietnam and then was able to go off to college. And the other sort of turbulent or life-changing thing is as I committed my life to Jesus Christ, which changed me in quite a significant way. Entering the Navy was not what I expected that I would do with my life, but 1974 then had two particular events. Halfway through college, I decided to opt out of pre-med studies and join the Navy Nuclear Propulsion Scholarship Program, which meant in 2 years I was going to compress normal midshipman training and get prepared for the Navy. The other thing that happened in 1974 is I became fascinated with Jimmy Carter, who was announcing his candidacy for the presidency. And he was emerging at that time. Do any of you remember that period? He just seemed like a very charismatic option. We're fading away from Watergate, and the choice was Gerald Ford or Jimmy Carter. And he had written a book at the time, Why Not the Best?, his biography. And I managed to read that and found a lot to admire. And forgive me for doing so, but I kind of compared myself to him in a few ways. you can see the things that he talked about, his Christian life, talked about his service as a naval officer in the nuclear navy, mentioned things like being a governor and a peanut farmer. And when I looked at the list, I said, well, 3 out of 4 isn't too bad. You know, I can claim some of those things. And actually, Eagle Scout was something I could boast about that he was not. He made it as far as star. Any Boy Scouts in the crowd? Yeah, look at that. Very good. So prominent in the book, Why Not the Best, was his interview with Admiral Rickover, the father of the nuclear navy. The interview is something that was required of all nuclear officers for acceptance into the program. And these were notorious events that involved all kinds of legends of abuse, where candidates were locked in closets and humiliated in various ways. And it all seemed like revenge that Rickover had suffered. He was a Jewish man in the Naval Academy, quite an unusual circumstance, and he suffered a lot of personal abuse and hazing from that time. So it seemed like he carried that forward into this part of his service. And of course, he accomplished great things establishing the nuclear navy. And the point of that is not revenge, but he was really looking to test the candidates under pressure. When presented with something unexpected, how do you react? And so it turns out in Carter's interview, Carter talked about it lasting several hours, and he didn't seem to describe anything adverse, but just conversation that Rickover wanted to know. And he asked him this question, said, well, how did you do in the academy? How were your grades? And Carter, gave him a little kind of proud. I got a bunch of C's, a bunch of B's, and Rickover looked at him and said, well, did you do your best? And he said, well, no, I guess I didn't. And Rickover responded, why not? Which was quite a formative response in Carter's life. So it turned out I had an interview with Rickover in January of '76. Mine didn't last several hours. It was about 45 seconds, literally. You sit down in this chair where the legs aren't quite even, and he's studying his papers like some insignificant person walked into the room, and without even looking up, he says, why do you want the program? And I started to answer, and he immediately blew up into a tirade, swearing at me, and I just sat there and looked at him, and when he was done, I gave him a brief answer, and he basically said, get out. It turned out I passed the interview. So I just thought in finishing this slide, the picture in the upper corner there, the fact that Rickover is kind of smiling is a very unusual photograph. I think what happened is he probably told a wry joke about Carter, who enjoyed it, and you get a very brief smile out of the admiral. But the two men were good friends and allies over the years. So, naval career is measured in tours of duty, and my first tour was this 1 year of intensive training in nuclear science, all kinds of engineering studies and prototype training. And then my second tour, my career kind of had this Robert Frost theme. If you're familiar with the poem, Two Roads Diverged in a Yellow Wood, or something like that, and the punchline is a road less traveled by. It seemed like I had a knack for always choosing or volunteering for the other thing, like opting out of med studies and going into the Navy as one. But my second tour, rather than going to an active duty ship and actually getting the experience that young officers should have, I went to Newport News Naval Shipyard. They needed young officers to help finish the construction of the Mississippi and do reactor plant testing, which was a really fascinating experience of a heavy industrial environment. All kinds of, every day was lots of arc welders and grinders, and the smells of well, you got the kind of the rancid shipyard smells anyway, but then all of this other stuff. But very fascinating, learning the ship down to the last nuts and bolts, every little compartment on board. My first job on this nuclear ship actually was custodian of the ship's sewage system. And I thought if Paul Weidman was here, he might appreciate hearing that. But yeah, we all got to start somewhere. Well, the ship finished its, trying to get that cursor to behave here. The ship finished its construction and went under commissioning ceremony. So Rickover and Carter came down to Newport News, and I had a brief encounter again. There were a lot of Navy brass there, but the ship's officers, including myself, were standing on deck when Carter and Rickover walked by. And it turned out this would not actually be the last time. There'd still be one more event. So I like to think of the nuclear navy, the cruiser navy, as the elite service. Most nuclear candidates end up in submarines, which I did not do, road less traveled by. But the cruisers were very important because they can operate at high speed and escort the aircraft carriers, which are also nuclear, and do all kinds of high-speed operations for flight ops and so forth. So one thing the cruiser Navy liked to do was take pictures, that's what this is about, and it just turned out that this ship, still fighting my computer, I'm sorry. There it is. This is actually a little later than 1980, but they got us all together in the Caribbean for a photo opportunity. Some of you were in the other kind of military, the Army, Marines, where you marched around a lot, right? Well, this is the Navy equivalent of that. We get the ships together and they get in parade formation. There's nobody to view it. I mean, the guys on the ship can't see what's going on either. So the only audience was a lonely helicopter flying around with a Navy photographer who, takes a few pictures and then it's all done. Just to brag on the ships, each one of these is about 2 football fields long, 600 feet, 10,000 tons. And I don't know if you watch the Super Bowl, you've got an idea what a football field looks like. So. Nice big ships, plenty of action. So in that photo op, I managed to pull off the first selfie before that was a thing. I took a picture of my ship, the Mississippi, the 40. And the way I did that, if you're wondering, if you're curious, I was actually standing on my next ship, the California, the 36, which is the one that's part of the story here now about Operation Eagle Claw. I had finished my tour on the Mississippi, studied for advanced engineering quals, and now had reported to the California as a main propulsion assistant. And this is that ship. Kind of looks like the other one. Sorry, they all kind of have gray and steel and superstructures and things. So that was December of 1979. I went through Admiral Rickover's offices a second time for that certification to be a supervisor of nuclear plants as chief engineer. And before transferring to California, personal note, I got 2 weeks of special leave to stay home with Linda, who had just given birth to our first child. So Lisa, and Davis just has, how old's your child now? 3? So enjoy that while you can. So after the 2 weeks at home, just after New Year's, I flew out to Italy to join the ship. And the California was at 5 months into a normal 6-month deployment in the Mediterranean with the Nimitz aircraft group. And I was looking forward to this. I mean, yeah, I had a brand new baby, but getting to go on a med cruise was like the cream of the tours there. I remember Joe Messick, you talked about a few of yours. And deployments are hard on family life, but a med cruise kind of takes the sting out of that. And it was often the option that officers would fly their wives out to visit them in the various exotic ports. So this is actually the deployment map we all got as a memento after the deployment. If you see the green lines waving back and forth, that gives you an idea. Some of the different ports that were visited. And oh yeah, in between that, they cruised around waving the flag and doing the Navy thing. So I flew into Rome somehow, got down to Naples, got on board the ship. It got underway almost immediately. And we had a tour to go over to Cartagena, Spain, which was the only thing I could brag about as far as my delightful time in the Med. We went to Cartagena, took a little car trip into Granada, and saw this beautiful Moorish castle called Alhambra. Anybody been there? Yeah, just a fascinating place. And it was Washington Irving wrote the stories, Tales of La Alhambra. Very interesting literature. But what happened now, to get to our story, is 2 months earlier in November of '79 is when the Iranian students had seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and seized 52 American hostages. Now, the Pacific 7th Fleet was in the Indian Ocean, already overextended on their deployment when this happened, so the commanders of the Navy decided that they needed to be relieved and would task the Nimitz task force, who was almost done with their med cruise, decided they were going to go to the Indian Ocean. Now, if you're probably aware of the Nimitz, if you've seen a few Hollywood movies, they seem to love putting that thing out there, and it's always been the nation's flagship, and it was a perfect way to upgrade our presence in the Indian Ocean, given this crisis that was going on at the time. The two older carriers out there were the Kitty Hawk and the Midway, that were conventionally powered ships, so putting nukes out there was going to be just a strong waving of the flag for the country. Only problem is that being in the Med, you'd think we could go through the Suez Canal to get there quickly, but nuclear-powered ships were not allowed through the Suez, so they said, okay, you're going around Africa, and we undertook a high-powered run, 15,000 miles roughly, that took 3 weeks at full power the whole time to get there, which was kind of exciting but also kind of boring, because for engineers anyway, you're in the plant and you're watching these needles on the steam pressures and the temperatures. Nothing's moving, everything's steady state, burning up a lot of nuclear fuel. And we made it almost without a hitch. Now, my job as main propulsion assistant to the engineer is to help keep the reactors going and the lights on and the engines turning. And late one morning, we're already most of the way up the east side of Africa. I was crossing the mess decks, going down to check on things in number one engine room, when I heard the sound of turbines winding down and the lights flickered, and I'm thinking, that doesn't seem good, something's not right. And all of a sudden, I'm just about to put my hand on the engine room door, and the door flies open, and this very nervous looking machinist mate bursts out with a cloud of steam following him, which is quite abnormal. If you're not sure what I'm saying, that is not a very good thing at all. Pretty traumatic event, and it took us a few days to recover from, but hey, we're Navy, so we did it. So. And we arrived at Gonzo Station. Sound familiar? Stands for Gulf of Oman Naval Zone of Operations, but they were really just looking for a clever way to, the Sesame Street and the Muppets were a thing back in the 70s, if you remember. So what does the military do when it turns over command? It holds a parade, just like the Marines or the Army, right? So we march all of our ships back and forth. And this is the Nimitz battle group with the Midway and Kitty Hawk all together. And you've probably seen a picture like this in the World War II movies, or anybody watched the, what was that called, the Victory at Sea newsreels at the time, projecting the image of power. And I remember writing home or hearing from home, and Linda mentioned that she and others were worried about our safety, and I'm thinking, look at this, what do we got to worry about? You know, we've got all kinds of armament and defense zones and all of that kind of thing, and if anything, we were kind of worried about our families back home, given all the stuff going on in the culture there. But this is a classic image of the Navy projecting sea power, which was the mode of operation at that time for several decades. America projecting its presence around the globe. And it really is a formidable force, not only the ships, but we had some fantastic aircraft that were the force multipliers. Like the tip of the spear was this F-14 Tomcat, just a wonderful fighter plane, and Top Gun, right? Tom Cruise, all of that glitzy stuff. These really were just wonderful planes to behold flying. We'd be out just steaming along on a very quiet afternoon, and you suddenly hear this tiny little sound in the back of your ear, and the plane comes soaring by on just 50 feet off the deck, and then take off almost vertically just to razzle us. There's like some scene in a movie where the officer's holding his coffee, getting ready to take a drink, and that goes by and everything gets spilled. But the aircraft, talking about the power, the zone of power, they extend the influence of the carrier groups hundreds of miles because of their range of operation. And then under the water, the silent service, there were typically a few submarines around just to keep an eye on things and keep us defended. The Russian Navy was our primary adversary at the time, and they really had no dog in this fight, so we were not concerned about that kind of interaction, and just frankly, we felt kind of invincible. The only real threat we had was that we knew that the Iranians had patrol boats that were equipped with Chinese silkworm anti-ship missiles, and we know how those can do damage. The USS Stark had a disaster a few years later than that. So we practiced, we worked on defense for, the contingency of something like that was to happen. So there we were in command of Gonzo Station. The other two carrier groups had gone home, and we just were steaming around, keeping an eye on things. We did not normally steam like this. This is, again, one more parade shot. It's not smart to put all your ships that close together because you're either a bigger target or you might actually accidentally collide with one another. So typically what happened is the California and the other cruisers would be out on a 10-mile perimeter from the carrier providing zone defense, just sort of like in basketball. So our normal daily mode was something like this. Lots of sky and water and sunsets. Can anybody see another ship in that picture? Yeah. And that might be kind of rare, but yeah, whenever you went up on deck, you'd look around and you might see the other cruiser out there somewhere. And as I said, the other visitors we had would be the aircraft that came on their way back to the carrier, might come and play a little game with us like frisky little dolphins, to give us a little treat. We actually had a T-shirt that said Gulf of Oman. I think it said Surf and Swim Club. Linda knows I keep T-shirts way too long. It was a blue one. Remember that? Yeah, we got rid of it. Oh, it's like 40 years ago. I'm showing you the map because try to give you some context. We're steaming around in the lower right corner there, Gonzo Station in the Gulf of Oman, steaming in circles, conducting flight ops and just training drills of various type, just hoping we're going to frighten the Iranians into letting the hostages go. If Carter and his group were planning something, we didn't understand what role we could possibly play in it because it was way too far away from Tehran to reach up there and do something. We were breaking records for the number of days at sea. Now, bear in mind, this is already past our time of a normal deployment, but we steamed around there. We did not get close to land. We just saw a lot of water. There was one exception. I see the reference to Karachi up there. Karachi is in Pakistan, and it's just in the lower right corner, if you can see that there. That's why I asked you to come forward. One day, there was a report that a civilian freighter had caught fire out in the Gulf there, and the California was detached to go over and provide assistance. So we towed the ship into the port of Karachi. And the only reason I wanted to mention that is one of the few exceptions to the mundane day-to-day operations out there. And the memory I want to share with you that you might be able to relate to, here in Pennsylvania we have a phenomenon when the farmers spread liquid manure on the fields. Can you all relate to that? And I just want to tell you, when you smell that the next time, give thanks that it's not Karachi. All right, we got close to Karachi. The water was very brown, the air was very foul, and we were glad to put that freighter into port and get away from there as fast as we could. And I mentioned the Strait of Hormuz. That's the little elbow, almost lower center there. That's the pinch point for ships going into the Persian Gulf, and that has been mentioned in news stories over the years since then. The Iranians like to shut that down or attack ships going through there. We would go through there very infrequently, but we had this little drill where we would try to sneak up in there. What was going on is we had a Russian trawler shadowing us. A spy ship, they like taking pictures of us and report back to their command what we're up to. So we'd just run up there and give them a thrill, not that it was really accomplishing anything. And so the rest of the time we did what we possibly could. Those of you in the military knew you spent a lot of time training and maintaining. So we got to do something like this every once in a great while, a practice missile launch. And I had the thrill of taking this photograph myself. What you might not understand from the picture is that thing takes off on the rail in a split second. Like that, and it's gone. And I was standing there with my camera behind the bridge window, and a tremendous sonic boom as that explosion happened. So I kind of had my camera aimed and my eyes closed. As soon as I sensed something happening, I hit the shutter, and I got a pretty perfect shot there. All right. And the other time, most of the Indian Ocean is calm, but you had some rough days. And if you've been on a cruise ship, you probably didn't get to enjoy this kind of rough weather because the cruise ships are so big. But it's kind of fun to have those waves splashing over the bow and the spray hitting you in the face. So we've been on a couple of cruises, and Linda knows I would go out at night hoping I'd get some rough weather and spray on my face. So. Okay, well, Morale Day finally came. We had broken so many records for days at sea without a port visit or even seeing land that something very unusual was authorized, helicopters brought pallets of beer and steaks over to the ship, and we had a picnic on the fantail. They grilled the steaks. Everybody got 2 cans of beer to enjoy. And then we had an air show from the Nimitz. They had about 100 airplanes on that thing and different types. And they came out and gave this mind-blowing air show. The F-14s doing all their dog fights and up and down acrobatics. They had some attack planes dropping bombs in our wake. Lots of excitement there. And it just was it was over way too soon, I guess, is probably the one thing to take away from that. So if you're bored, I've succeeded in conveying the sense at this point. We'll get on with the program now. After all of that, it finally became apparent to us that something was developing, and unbeknownst to us, actually back in 1979, in those first months after the takeover of the embassy, that they had started planning an operation. Strike forces were out in the western desert of the U.S. rehearsing what they needed to rehearse. And they had flown out a squadron of these, they're called RD, somebody, who's my helicopter expert? Here we go. RH-53D Sea Stallion helicopters. These are pretty formidable machines. They're used for things like mine sweeping and other operations. And so the story was that, well, they must be used for mine sweeping in the Strait of Hormuz to keep the Persian Gulf open. But actually what was going on is they stripped them down out on the carrier there to reduce the weight so that their range was extended. They painted them desert brown for what was being planned. Even took windows out and other equipment to make them as light as possible. And our captain had gone over to the Nimitz a couple times for some secret briefings. He didn't tell us what was going on. We just assumed it was normal operations. But it was all getting ready for the big day. So it was the evening of April 24th. I was normally a nuclear engineer standing watch, but also learning to stand watch on the bridge, and I happened to have bridge watch that night. The sun had gone down, and I noticed a cloud on the radar scope of 8 dots departing the aircraft carrier. I thought, boy, that's interesting. What could that be? And I reported that to the captain who was on the bridge, and he gets on the ship's announcing system and told us our battle group was about to undertake a special mission, and he promised he could give us details 24 hours later, and that we would be very proud to be serving in the U.S. Navy. I said, wow, that's pretty incredible. We still couldn't imagine what it would be. What would helicopters do that had something to do with Tehran? If anybody is really paying attention and you know some of the story, this photo was not that moment of departure, but they were flying around earlier. There's only 6 helicopters there. 8 were needed for the mission, and let me explain what's going on now. Can you see that reasonably well? Of course, we're down in Gonzo Station, and you see Desert 1, Desert 2, and the red text says Tehran. So somebody asked me if I was going to reveal confidential information here, and the answer is no. This is all open source. The mission essentially involved 8 helicopters from the Nimitz, and the mission planners knew that they needed a minimum of 6 helicopters to complete the mission, so they, as risk management, added 2 more. There were also 6 C-130 transport planes that were taking off from Oman. 3 of those aircraft had fuel bladders to refuel helicopters, and the other 3 were carrying the Delta Force troops commanded by Colonel Charlie Beckwith. This is probably like the first major operation involving special forces. And the plan was here on night number 1 is for the helicopters to fly to that spot called Desert 1, where they would be met by the refueling planes, refueled, and also the Delta Force combined with them. And on night number 2, so they're going to linger in the desert over that next day, but in darkness on the second night, fly on the helicopters into Desert 2, just outside of Tehran, where they were going to be met with CIA operatives. And the rest of the plan, basically, there were Army Rangers that were going to take the airfield in Tehran. The CIA operatives were providing transportation for the troops to get into Tehran, rescue the hostages, and get everybody to the airport where they would be flown out in C-141s. Of course, that's not what happened, is it? We all know the story. In fact, you know the story better than we did on our ship because we got so little information about this. But what happened, and I'm just reconstructing by doing my own research after the fact here, on the way from that aircraft carrier inland there's a few unfortunate things happened. The first helicopter, they were codenamed Bluebeard. Bluebeard 6 had a cracked rotor blade, so it landed somewhere, and a second helicopter landed with him and rescued the crew, and they resumed on their duty, but that helicopter was out of commission. Second helicopter, Bluebeard 5, got lost in the dust storm. You've seen these on the movie, this big dust cloud, dust storm, they call them haboobs. And that one helo had such disorientation that he turned around and flew back to the carrier. Finally, arriving at Desert 1, third helicopter, Bluebeard 2, had a hydraulics failure that they deemed was unrepairable, and which caused a whole bunch of consternation. Charlie Beckwith was furious. Of course, he wanted this mission to succeed, but he refused to do it with fewer than 6 helicopters. So they satellite phoned that back to Washington for a decision recommending abort. They knew they should not continue given the parameters of the mission. And after some hours, Washington got back to them. In the meantime, they had a few incidents. You might remember they had a bus of Iranians came by they had to detain, and then a fuel truck was driving by. They actually blew that up with a rocket launcher of some kind, creating all kinds of confusion and unwanted attention. But of course, this is what happened. Washington ordered the abort, and over the next few minutes, they were finishing up refueling the helicopters to fly them back out when Bluebeard 3 had a mishap with one of the C-130s, causing the explosion. 8 crewmen were killed, and the rest is public knowledge. Well, the next evening I was on watch again, this time in the engine room, and the captain came on the announcing system one more time with the sad news, and he said that we had attempted the rescue mission, but it failed, resulting in, as you know, loss of several helicopters, aircraft, and the lives of 8 servicemen. And so despite the planning and rehearsing, there was a sandstorm, an unknown, an uncontrolled unknown that created enough confusion to disrupt the mission and embarrass the nation. So in retrospect, to the armchair quarterbacks, it probably seemed like a plan with too many moving parts. and others just that it was an extremely bold and risky attempt. In recent years, Carter had been asked any regrets, and what did he say? He said, "I should have ordered a ninth helicopter." I wonder what that would have been like had that succeeded. But this is the story we know. So a monument was erected in Arlington Cemetery to honor the 8 men who died on the mission. These were 3 Marines and 5 airmen from the transport plane. And these are their names and faces, which serves as a reminder that even in a peacetime Navy, military personnel face danger and gives their lives for their fellow Americans. We know this happened just a couple of weeks ago in Washington with a helicopter colliding with the airplane. So after the inauguration of Reagan, the hostages were released in January of 1981, and it occurs to me what a different country we would be if the mission had succeeded. Carter possibly would have been reelected. We wouldn't have known the administration of Ronald Reagan, and what other dominoes might have fallen or not fallen since then. And would we have had 2 versions of Desert Storm and 9/11 and Afghanistan and some of those others? Well, to wrap this up, the epilogue is a few weeks later, the Nimitz crew was ordered to return home. There was another carrier group coming in to relieve us. So off we go, heading back around Africa. And we were still unaware of the details of the missions, but had been proud to have been a part. As we passed Diego Garcia, about 2,000 miles to the south, I was flown off of the rear deck of the California over to the Nimitz. A small group of officers was being sent home early so that we could be in Norfolk to help plan an arrival party for the whole battle group. And so I just threw in a couple more pictures here. This just give you a sense of day in the life on a cruiser. Helicopter operations were almost a daily event, and often you'd be spirited off the back of the ship by hoisting operation like that. And so these are the SH-3 Sea King helicopters, a nice workhorse for the Navy. And so we got a little shore tour briefly. We stopped, that small group of officers got to stay on Diego Garcia overnight before we were flown home. And when you know, just yesterday in the news, I'm here in Diego Garcia. Anybody pick that up? Well, there's a thing going on. Diego Garcia is a British territory because of their days with India and all of that. But apparently there's a move to turn the island group over to the island of Mauritius, and that's causing a bit of political turmoil. It has been a very important military outpost for the U.S. and the British, especially with all of the recent years of Iraq, Desert Storm, and all of those operations. So I had the fun of flying home then. We stopped in Nairobi, Kenya, and then in Spain, quick refueling, and got home. And I remember very little of that, just the weird morning air in Nairobi. It just was a pleasant break in what we were experiencing being cooped up on an airplane for so long. So I didn't just get the T-shirt. We got these mementos like this map to hang on our wall to remind ourselves of the deployment. And the red path, if you can see, this time we're heading back to the East Coast. But that was the ship. I was on the airplane, and so on a humid Virginia evening in May, I was greeted by Linda, who took me the rest of the way home. I can't remember where was that, Norfolk Airport? Yeah. I'll take your word for it. Holy cow. So all I remember about that, glad to be home. In the back of the car, a 5-month-old baby screamed all the way home because a strange man was in the front seat with her mother. So we have since become much better acquainted, my daughter and I. So this is what the party looked like, the battle group homecoming. There we are. Of course, I was already ashore, but the Nimitz, and you can see the other 2 cruisers up ahead already having made the tour in Hampton Roads Harbor, heading for the piers. And this is where I want to return the focus to Jimmy Carter. I think he demonstrated good leadership, taking responsibility for the failure, but also recognizing the efforts and sacrifices of his people. And so they arranged this special homecoming. It was coinciding with Memorial Day in 1980, and Carter came down personally to welcome us home, just like he had been there for the commissioning of my other ship. And Norfolk, being a Navy town, wanted to celebrate the return of its crewmen. And thanks to the internet nowadays, you can actually, there's like a 3 or 4 minute news clip from the local TV station. You can watch this whole thing live. So we get to summarize 40 years of history now. That November, Carter lost the election. That's November 1980. January, Reagan takes office. The hostages freed that same day. And Carter flew out to Wiesbaden, Germany, to welcome them home as he had welcomed us. March 1981, those of us on the California were already back on deployment directly to the Indian Ocean this time with the America Battle Group. And Ed Gill, I don't see him here today. Ed was on the America in the air wing, so we've had a couple of conversations about what that was like. Our main point of going back there, I think, was just to maintain presence. Not sure if we would have thought of doing another rescue mission, but there we were, out serving. Carter served many more years after his administration. We know him as a peacemaker and a home builder for Habitat and for Humanity, a Bible study teacher at his church, and at 100 years old, he was the oldest living president. And I want to shine the spotlight on that for just a minute or two before we close. For him, the word retirement did not exist, I maintain anyway, and it's something we might consider here. We all aspire to something in our lives here at Cornwall Manor. I marked December 2024 at the end, and he passed there, I think, on the 29th. My last little hurrah here after that, my next tour of duty, I actually went to IBM, who was a prime contractor for another helicopter system, which seemed to be in my blood. This is the Lamps Mark III Seahawk, known as the SH-60, and some of you, and we keep seeing this, the H-60s and the various versions of this in all of the services for the last 40 years. An unfortunate one, it was one of these that collided with the airplane in Washington a few weeks ago. But this was a pretty special project, and just one more stepping stone to some of the other things I enjoyed doing in my career. If you want to read more or learn more about the operation, I found some resources here. Kyle wrote a book, The Guts to Try, and this other book by Wilkinson, Operation Eagle Claw. And finally, there's just an open source Joint Chiefs report that anyone can download. It has got all of the nuts and bolts, the nitty-gritty of this. So one thing that came out of this whole experience for the United States military was much soul-searching and development of new systems and tactics. The Joint Special Operations Command, which we've heard so much about over the various decades, and improvements to systems. So let me close with this tribute to Jimmy. We do admire him for his lifetime achievements, even though some had criticized his administration. And I think what does not get said in public enough is this, is that, and I think it's important here in this community, he demonstrated the joy of abundant life, the kind of life that Jesus said he came to give us. Everything Jimmy did, I think, was accomplished as a fruit of the Holy Spirit working through him. He would tell you, I think, his greatest achievement was turning and surrendering his life as a young man to following Christ. And we can imagine Jesus' words to his faithful steward, "Well done, good and faithful steward, enter your rest." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Very interesting program. We were very pleased that you were able to do this for us. And thank you to all of you for coming out on this weather questionable day. All the men joining us and then the ladies as well. Thank you very much and have a safe drive or walk back home. Thank you.